Hi, and welcome to another episode of Orthodox Family Life. Today we'll be discussing how to choose good books for your children. We all know that reading is good for children, and we all want our children to read a lot and to read well and to read broadly. And if you listen to educators very closely, you will often hear them say that if children read more, we would have fewer educational problems. The children would be able to spell better, they would be able to write better, they would be able to speak better. And they often add to this that it doesn't really matter what your kids read as long as they're reading. However, I strongly disagree with this. I'm here to tell you that not every book is worth reading. Some books are so harmful to your children that they should never be read, and your children would actually be better off to be illiterate than to read these books. We should remember that language skills are not our only goal. Our main goal as parents is to develop in our children healthy attitudes, healthy morals, and especially healthy souls. Now, if you think about it for a moment, books change you. When you get involved in reading a book, you are often thinking about the characters, the moral dilemmas. You often will maybe start talking like them or incorporate some of their vocabulary into your language. And so I think that if you sit down and you read Jane Eyre for 2 weeks, then it's going to change you in a positive way. It's a nice, healthy book. If you, instead of that, read 50 Shades of Grey, which is a very terrible pornographic book, you're going to be a different person at the end of that. That book is going to harm you. And of course, if you spent those 2 weeks reading The Life of a Saint, you would be much, much better off. Your soul would be healthier. Your attitudes would begin to change. You would actually see the world differently. And so we have to remember that when we read books, even as adults, those books change us. They somehow become part of us. And what we might not be realizing is that our children are being harmed by the books that they read. And they're being harmed mainly because we are not being attentive to what they're reading and what they think about what they're reading. Books are food for the mind. And if you want a healthy mind, you must give it healthy food. And so today I'd like to go over many different types of books and talk about how they are good or bad for your children. We'll start with fiction and then move on to nonfiction. And then finally, we'll get into a few questions about audiobooks, reading too much, and some of the troubling news on the horizon about books being made now. So let's begin with the best books of all, books that everyone should be reading as much as possible. And these, of course, are holy books. These are kind of the superfoods of the book world. This would be the Holy Scriptures, the lives of the saints, and their writings. Of course, here we first and foremost should mention the Holy Gospels. In the Holy Gospels, this is where we meet Christ himself. We hear about his life, we directly receive his teaching, and we come to know him as he has revealed himself to us. The Lives of Saints are another wonderful holy book that everyone should be reading. The wonderful thing about reading the Lives of the Saints is that we see examples of living out the Christian gospel in all places of the world and through all the different ages. We see women who are single, we see married men, we see monastics, we see kings and beggars. In the Lives of the Saints, you see really everybody that in the world can become a saint. It doesn't matter these earthly limitations that we have or these earthly categories that we're in. You can see how they have expressed the gospel truth in their own lives. And these stories are so important for children because they help build their faith in God. And they see people that are patient in suffering, and they have a boldness in their adversity. They see the martyrs who kind of talk back to the tyrants and taunt them, and they're not worried about losing their life. Reading these books builds a spiritual bank of wisdom in your child's heart. and it helps them to see the world as it truly is. So holy books should be read often and by everyone. Really, it should be a daily occurrence. So if those are the very best books, then let's talk about one category of some of the worst books, which would be what I call potato chip books. These are the junk foods of the book world, and they're actually not real books. So these would be books that maybe make sounds or have flashing lights. They have commercialized characters. They may have gross, weird, or disturbing illustrations. They have a very low level of English. The language is often not even very coherent. And these books are incredibly boring. You don't even need to donate these books to Goodwill. Just throw them out. They're not actual books. These are just marketing tools. They were created to be bought, and they're not really created by someone who had a wonderful story to tell. Now, if you're not sure if this is a potato chip book that you have in your hand, you can just read a page or two. Was it really boring? Would you be happy if your child spoke like that? Are the pictures in it disturbing or just strange? All of these things we want to purge out of our libraries. They're not real books. They're just a marketing tool. Some examples of this might be a book on Star Wars or Thomas the Tank Engine. Really, they typically are focused on a cartoon character and sometimes maybe animals or something that's very generic, trucks, but they're pretty easy to see. So these aren't real books. They're just a gimmick. So get them out of your library. Okay, so for the next part, we're going to break down fiction into 4 basic categories based on what type of story they're telling. And I want to give thanks here to Andrew Pudewa from the Institute for Excellence in Writing, where I got this division from. But I think it's incredibly helpful in the way we think about books. So the first type of fiction would be whole stories. These are books where good is portrayed as good, and bad is portrayed as bad, and good wins. In this, we see that the protagonist overcomes their struggles. Now, they could be very small struggles like Corduroy, and he has this small, winnable battle over loneliness. Or it could be Wilbur from Charlotte's Web being saved from the slaughterhouse. Or in our classic novels, in Jane Eyre, will Jane resist sin and find authentic love? Or will Oliver escape Fagin and his family? In Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. These are what we might think of as our classic good versus evil stories. These books teach children that their struggles can be overcome. These are especially needed now as our culture continues to grow more depressed, more negative, sarcastic, and insane. These stories are full of just normal, good is good, and good wins. This really should be the foundational group after holy books of what your children read. Okay, so let's move on to our second category. That would be healing stories. Now, healing stories are actually my favorite story, and they're also a very positive story, just like the whole story. But in healing stories, good is portrayed as good, bad is portrayed as bad, and good wins, though not in the way you might expect. My favorite healing story would be The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. This story is both beautiful and tragic. This is the tragic story of a young girl in London who is cruelly beat by her father and his mother and sent out on the streets every day to sell matches, even in the freezing cold. The story happens on New Year's Day, I believe, and she is trying to sell the matches, and as she is selling them, she gets so cold that she has to actually light a match just to stay warm and keep her from freezing. With every match that she lights, she beholds a beautiful vision of a roasted turkey dinner in one case, or dancing food in another. But then as the match goes out, the vision disappears and she's once again on the cold London streets, freezing to death. The very last match that she ignites, she has a vision of her grandmother that has died many years ago and was the only person that ever loved her. And as that vision starts to fade away with the flicker of the last match, she frantically lights her entire handful of matches. And in a great blaze, she sees her grandmother welcoming her into heaven. And the very last line of the story is that the Londoners found her cold, dead body in the snow the next morning. And they had no idea what angelic glory she had gone to paradise with. And the story just gets me every time because on the one hand, it is very tragic. It's about the death of a young, abused child who no one in the world cared for. And yet we see this beauty in it, that the world is not always as it appears, that there's a spiritual realm and that God is there and he makes things right. These healing stories also remind me of the stories of the martyrs. In a way, they're healing stories, even though they're actually obviously true. To many people standing by, the martyrs just lost their life without any reason. But to those who had the eyes to see, what they actually saw was quite glorious. People being welcomed into heaven and taking down huge tyrants. It's that hidden triumph. Good wins, but not everyone can see it. And I think these stories help children learn that even if bad things happen, which they will, we can have faith that God sets things right in the end, even though we perhaps cannot see it yet. These stories teach us to wait until we pass judgment, that God, in his goodness and in his mercy, has the last word in the end and will set all things right. So those are the healing stories. Now our next category is called broken stories. This is where good is portrayed as good, bad is portrayed as bad, but bad wins. These are actually usually cautionary tales. The one that comes to mind for me is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Which is, of course, about Dr. Jekyll, who I forget what he's coming up with. He's coming up with some scientific formula for strength or something. And as he takes it, he begins to turn into Mr. Hyde, who is very evil. And the next day he wakes back up again and he's Dr. Jekyll, I believe, again. It's been a while since I've read this one. But the idea is that Dr. Jekyll is fighting with this desire for power, and when he's Mr. Hyde, he's very powerful, and yet he's evil, and so he keeps wanting to not take the potion again, but he keeps finding himself taking it again and again, until in the end he basically gives himself over to being Mr. Hyde permanently. And it's a really dark tale. Cautionary tales, these broken stories, are very dark, and Pinocchio would be another one, the classic story of Pinocchio. These are stories we have to be really careful about. I think there can be a place for cautionary tales, but for a lot of children, it's too much, especially young or sensitive children. And I think as the older I get, I see less and less value in these books. So if you're going to read broken stories, I would definitely read these books ahead of time. Really monitor how your child is doing with them. I guess the argument behind these books of why they would be okay, something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Pinocchio, would be that you want your child to see the dumb thing that they're going to do before they do it. So if Mr. Pudewa talks about reading Pinocchio to his child, and at one point his son yells out, "No, Pinocchio, don't do it," because he knows Pinocchio is about to do something stupid again and get in all kinds of trouble. And while obviously there is value in that, you have to kind of weigh that against how dark is the story and how is your child doing with that. So I would just show extreme caution with these types of stories because they are very disturbing. In the end, bad wins. There's no redemption. And I would say if you're going to do these, be really careful and don't do too many. And that's a pretty big if for me. Now, the last type of fiction stories are called twisted stories. These are stories that portray good as evil and evil as good. Now, these books are really only found in the modern world, and unfortunately, I think that now they are becoming the most common type of book. These, I think, should be completely avoided. They're very disturbing, and I think that they cause a lot of destruction in the mind of a child that's still forming ideas about how the world is constructed. And these twisted stories can be done in a couple of different ways, but one of the main ways is the twisting of archetypes. So archetypes are symbols and stories that over the ages have meant the same thing over and over. So we might say kings are good. You know, if you read the old fairy tales or old mythology, they'll often start with there was a good king that had everything but wanted a child, something like that. And the king is there. He's there to save and protect the people and give his life for the people, because ultimately an archetype is actually also based in reality, right? And if Christ is our king, he's the actual king that all other kings are kind of based on in a way. And dragons are another symbol, an archetype of evil, right? In the old stories, dragons are always evil. Kings are always good, dragons are evil, and dragons must be dealt with. They must be killed. They must be destroyed. So if you look at the modern stories, what we're now seeing are lovable dragons, trainable dragons, right? Dragons have become almost their own genre of books. And there's entire dynasties of dragons and good dragons and bad dragons. And it's a very large topic now. And kings we now see, and maybe this is part of us being Americans and our history is around rejecting a king, right? But kings now in literature have often become evil. And I'm going to switch here to talking about a movie, because there's a movie that really it demonstrates this quite well in a very intentional way that I think you'll be able to see it. So the movie Maleficent came out maybe about 10 years ago. And Maleficent is the story of Sleeping Beauty retold in a live action movie, retold through the eyes of the evil fairy. So if you go back to the Disney version, which is of course not the original Hans Christian Andersen or Grimm's Brothers fairy tale, if you go back to the old cartoon, probably done in the 50s or 60s, they've remade that now into a live action movie and flipped the point of view of the story. And all you really have to do is watch the trailer for this. The trailer for this movie, and I've seen the whole movie, so I can confirm it's in the whole movie, but the trailer says, this is the story that you've heard, but you were lied to. And the story is that Maleficent is telling her backstory to the young Princess Aurora. And she's saying, Aurora asks her, why don't you have wings? And Maleficent answers, I had wings once, but they were taken from me. And it turns out, she tells Aurora that Aurora's father, the king, used to be her best friend, but in a fit of treachery and jealousy, he takes her wings away and locks them up. And she was the one that was betrayed. She's actually the good one. He's actually the evil one. And so I want you to think about this for a minute. We have a character named Maleficent, which if you look it up in the dictionary, it means intending harm or evil. She's meeting a girl in the garden. She's telling the girl that the king has lied to her and that the story is not what she thinks, that she's actually the good one and the friend of the girl. And the creature that's saying all of this is a wingless fairy, we could say angel. So I hope you're picking up on all of that imagery, right? To me, this very quickly became an image of Adam, or rather Eve, in the garden with the snake. And I think that a few years ago when this movie came out, people might have had a hard time seeing that. But I think with everything that's happened, we can now see that the retelling of the Christian story is happening all around us. People are saying, no, God is not who he said he was, right? And they're now claiming that evil is good and good is evil. And so this is an incredibly dangerous story. The movie is really full of that. And I would encourage you to at least go watch the trailer for it. If you had any doubt about it, they've made a second one. And the second movie is called Maleficent and the Mistress of Evil. A third one is now in production. Now, I know this isn't a book, but this way of categorizing stories between whole books, healing books, broken books, and twisted books really works for any kind of story, right? So movies are stories. And so everything I'm saying about books and the types of books you should be looking for applies also to movies. And so this picture of the woman in the garden, the being talked to by the fallen angel who has malintent for her, this is all on purpose. It's a rebranding of the story. And it's not the only recent one with movies. There's a very similar theme in one of the Thor movies, one of the Marvel Thor movies, where Thor's evil sister comes back and she claims the king was actually the evil one, and her army, the Dark Army, were thrown down into the underworld because the king feared her power. And so it's a retelling of the Christian story, if you listen very carefully, from the point of view of the devil. And what's even worse in that case is that as she's explaining the story to the other person in the scene, there's actually iconographic imagery happening on the ceiling of this hall in the palace. And I was so disgusted with this, as we saw it, we just stopped right there and said, that's enough. This is so blatant. This is a real, I believe, direct attack on our Christian faith, which might sound extreme, but we're going to keep going and just hold off judgment if you're not quite with me yet. And we're going to talk about some other things happening in children's literature. I don't want to get too caught up in the normalization of evil. I'd really like to come back to this theme at another time and give it a full podcast. And so going back to our twisted stories where good is portrayed as evil and evil is portrayed as good, we have the twisting of archetypes that we just discussed. We also have alternative lifestyle book. This is a huge issue right now. If you want an example, you can look up the book Lawn Boy. This is one of the books that are being added to children's libraries, even middle school and elementary school libraries. You can look it up on Amazon and read the reviews for yourself. This is about two young boys having a gay romance, and it gets very explicit. These books are growing in number. I live in California, and I know that we had a state proposition that actually funded alternative books for our library years ago. So if you go to the new book section, it's all going to be alternative lifestyle type of books. I'd say the last example in this twisted story area would be anything that undermines the Christian values. I would include in this category books about magic, aliens, books where the kids are demigods or kids with powers. This is another very popular type of book out there. I know one very popular book series called Percy Jackson, which I have read a little bit, and it's full of, quote unquote, demon cheerleaders and different gods trying to kill this young boy, Percy, who finds out that he is, his single mom is his mother, earthly mother, and then his father is Zeus. And so the child has all these abilities, and there's this kind of battle between all the ancient Greek gods to either help or harm him. Now, I want you to understand that I realize I am probably sounding like an alarmist at this point. However, I personally know homeschooled Christian children who have been impacted by these books to the degree that they actually started to believe that they were demigods. If you're giving this to your 10 or 11, 12-year-old, they're not fully formed. They don't fully have the way the world functions formed in their mind. And so when you give them a book that tells them, as this book does, Percy Jackson, if you have ADHD, this is actually a sign that you're a demigod and that you're better than just the normal 100% human people. Kids at that age are looking for something to identify with, right? To kind of explain some of their insecurities, some of the things that they're struggling with. And so what might seem like a harmless fantasy book, right? And it's based on the Greek gods and goddesses, which in a lot of classic circles are something that is read, those old stories. You might think, it's just a modern twist on that. That's not what it is at all. It's a very violent book. And honestly, even if that isn't enough for you to not read it, but it's just not well written to begin with. It's not a book that's going to give your child anything positive. In a lot of these books, there's not a clear good is good and bad is bad. It's very muddled. I would say very similar to how Darth Vader's character over the arc of all of the Star Wars was really changed, where he was at first we introduced as an evil character, and then we see his backstory, and he's a young, lovable kid, and then he's a teenager that's kind of struggling with some issues, and then we see where he finally turns into Darth Vader. But the interesting thing is there's a ton of marketing done to children with what we call bad Anakin in our family, with that material. You can buy a lunchbox with bad Anakin on it. Now, why would you do that? Is that a character you want your child to emulate? Is Darth Vader? I mean, it's like we don't even think about these things, what's happening. So we really have to not just accept things because they're popular or because our friends are doing it, but really think, is this a character I want my child to be like? Is this someone that they should look up to? And so again, those are the 4 types of stories. That would be the whole story, the healing story, broken stories, and twisted stories. Lastly, I forgot to mention there is another group, another category within this, which would be overly dark stories. And I would put here, I think Kite Runner is on this list for me, and also probably Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein is considered a classic. It's a very dark book. And again, if you have sensitive children or children that are maybe, you see that they're choosing a dark book after dark book after dark book, like that should alert you that something's not quite right. Kite Runner is actually listed on a couple of classic book lists, even though it's a modern book. In particular, I've seen it on Beautiful Feet, which I generally love their stuff, but they put it on the high school list with a warning. But this book has child rape in it. It's a story of, a little boy growing up in the Middle East, and he's basically raped in front of his friends. And I didn't know that was in the book when I started reading it, so it was really shocking to me. But this is why I'm telling you, it's really important that you vet these books that you give your children. Sometimes 99% of the book is great, and then you get a scene like that once your kids read it, it's too late. It's already part of their mind, right? And again, going back to the idea that everything that we read changes us. And that's pretty sobering, right? If we're going to read something pornographic or something super violent or dark, we're going to be different afterwards. Right? As opposed to, again, if we read The Life of a Saint or a really wholesome book where good is lifted up, where good is glorified, we're going to be different at the end. And again, one book may not seem like a lot, but that's not really what we're talking about now. We're talking about a tidal wave of books. And again, I think maybe a few years ago, people would have said I was being alarmist, but I hope now with everything that's happened in the last few years that people are waking up to, there is an actual, I believe, attack on our children, on their souls, that there are people out there that want to corrupt our children. their minds and their hearts. And it's our job as parents to be the gatekeeper for what our children, especially our young children, right? The younger they are, the more that's our job. But even as your children get older, if they come to you and they want to read one of these books like Kite Runner, look it up. Look it up on Amazon. You can look it up on another great site called booklooks.org that will actually detail and give you the exact passages of the book and tell you exactly what's in it, from profanity to sexual stuff, drug stuff, alternative lifestyle, cuss words. It'll tell you everything that's in there. And then you can have that discussion with your kid based on, where they are. But I wouldn't just let your kids blindly read what their friends are recommending or even things out of the library. One last thought on this. You might be tempted to say, these are just stories. It's just a children's book. Is it really that bad, or does it really matter? And I think, yeah, it does matter. Because the books that we give to our children form who they are. And if we give them books that normalize or even glorify evil, then we're going to get kids that see evil as normal or maybe even good. It's something I believe we should really take seriously. Okay, so let's move on from fiction into nonfiction. Now, I think there's a lot of emphasis on fiction, and I actually think probably too much. And some kids get easily addicted to fiction. I think in particular younger girls, maybe tweens who really love to read. And so that's something also that you have to watch out for. But nonfiction books really tend to resonate with some kids, especially boys. I had a boy and a girl in our family who really didn't like kind of your typical sweet, quote unquote, girl stories like Anne of Green Gables or, Caddy Woodlawn. It was just, as my son said, it was just a bunch of girls just doing stuff. And he wasn't interested. And so what he really found that he loved was books about actual true things. This would be history books, science books, books about famous people, or skills like how to weave a basket, or how to do some welding, or how to do home repair. Now, nonfiction books used to be staples in every home, but I think they're getting harder and harder to find now. If you go to the bookstore, if you go to the children's section of a bookstore, you'll notice that the classic book section is very tiny now. You'll also see a lot of potato chip books out that are, usually very cheaply made and just lots of glossy pictures to try to get you to buy it. But you'll also see in the science and the history that they're not actually books usually in the sense of where they tell the story of history, but they're more like encyclopedias where it'll be just short bits of information. And while I'm not against encyclopedia type books, I think there's a place for that, what I'm really talking about here is one book on one subject. So there's a really lovely book about Native Americans in our area called Adopted by Indians. And it's the true story of a man about 150 years ago, or maybe only 100 years ago, who was an early California settler. And when his mom died, his dad actually left him in the care of the local Indian tribe for a summer while the dad went out to hunt with the older son. And so this man tells his whole story. And of course, we'd call this a living book, right? It's one person telling a really great story, but it's a nonfiction book. And so it's just written very differently. It's a complex story. There's lots of really wonderful details and drawings on all of the different things that the Indians would make. But it's not like these encyclopedia type books where it's very disjointed, right? And the book is really about looking at the pictures. Let's be honest. It's about the really vibrant pictures of the animals in the wild, or about space, or, whatever the book is on. And so, again, there's a place for that type of book, but we also want to find good nonfiction books that are longer and stick with one subject. Some of my favorite books for children on this would be Gail Gibbon's books. She does a really wonderful job for younger kids' science type books. So she'll have a whole book on bees or ants. And I love them because they do have some nice pictures, some nice illustrations, but she also gets into the vocabulary of each subject, and she gives you a lot of information for a children's book, right? She kind of respects her reader in that way and gives them some nice hard facts to chew on. Another series that a lot of them are pretty good would be the Let's Read and Find Out series. I think there's about 200 books in these series, so I don't like all of them, but they're pretty easy to find, and I think they're pretty good, most of them. There's some here and there that you can look at and maybe not find too much value in, but another great science book for young kids. And then there's some history ones. I think there's a series like if you spent a day as a pioneer settler, and it's more of a question and answer format, but at least it's a longer section. Now, in this category of the nonfiction, kind of the single subject books that I'm talking about, you could also go and try to find some older books. These books really, I think, were a staple a long time ago, and we're really not producing these books as much now. The only other category I would say might be helpful are picture books that, again, are on one subject. So we used to have a really lovely book on pikas. So if you don't know what a pika is, it's a small rodent that lives in the high altitudes of the Sierra Nevadas. And it's a very, very cute little rodent with little round ears. And the rodent will clip the wildflowers in the summer and lay them out to dry on a rock and then carry them into the home that it's made in this little rock crevice. And so it's one of the few rodents that I think doesn't hibernate all winter because they actually store enough food to stay alive. So we had this really fun, informative nonfiction book on pikas that became a favorite with our families. Another great category here would be famous people. Again, I think this is where we get some crossover with the lives of the saints. And there's obviously some really great lives of the saints being produced now from New Rome Press and other great Orthodox publishers. But we do have some really great Americans too that I think you could look into, like George Washington Carver, just really phenomenal. Helen Keller, Frederick Douglass, some of the founding fathers. And this would include obviously some history, right? So you get a little bit of history, you get the biography. Some more books that boys in particular might enjoy would be books on history, specifically war and weaponry. They seem to love that. Books on how to do dangerous things. We have a really great book. I think it's called 50 Dangerous Things to Do, and it walks you through how to do them, from licking a battery to jumping off your roof. And I really love this book because it actually teaches kids how to manage risk. So they're very explicit, like some of this stuff is a little bit risky, but it's really good for kids to learn how to manage that. And if you do it with them, you're kind of overhearing what they're doing, keeping an eye on it. They're, for the most part, pretty safe, I think. There's also a lot of books on how to build stuff, more in the engineering world maybe, or there were those really lovely books on castles, or kind of lift the flap where you see the internal structures of ships and submarines. So don't overlook these books. We put, I think, way too much pressure on reading fiction, and there's certainly a place for that. But a lot of kids, especially boys, and especially kids that like to actually do stuff, to build forts and to dig holes, they want something that's real, right? They're not as interested in the stories. Now, unfortunately, there are some inappropriate nonfiction books that you should be careful about. Obviously, anything that is contradictory to our Orthodox faith. With science books, you might want to watch out for evolutionary material in there, climate alarmism, or phrasing creationist or Christians as stupid. I've seen that in different books. You also want to be careful with any kind of books around gender and sexuality. You would be surprised if you haven't gone to your local library and looked at the shelf in this area. I would really recommend that you do that without your children, but you will definitely find books on being gender fluid, gender queer, how-to books for different activities in the children's section. This is not something your children should be, look at without you in the library. Other inappropriate nonfiction books could be books on leftism. And here I'm not talking about being a Democrat, but actual leftist ideas like critical race theory, Marxism, social justice, pro-abortion rights. And then we just have, a lot of also very dark topics that there'll be entire books on these. Things like self-harm, unaliving yourself, aliens, witchcraft, magic, various mythical creatures like vampires, dragons. These are all not just in your library, but they're actually some of the hottest books out there. If you go to the library, you'll see that they're often facing out, or they're often on the new shelf, because again, money is being pumped into the library system, not just to buy books, but to buy these books. Okay, so not every nonfiction book is going to be appropriate for your kids. Okay, so moving on to a couple of other smaller topics, I would like to talk for a moment about audiobooks. Audiobooks sometimes, unfortunately, get a bad rap, I think. There is certainly a place for audiobooks. You're not going to get the same benefit that you get from silently reading a book to yourself, but I would say it's not less benefit, it's just different. And I think in some cases, it's actually better. So kids can actually listen and understand at a higher level than they can read. And so if you hand them, let's say, Jane Eyre, they may not be ready to sit down and read it. They might get lost in the story and not quite understand it. However, if you listen to Jane Eyre, they're much more likely to be able to stay with the story. That's not saying they're not ever going to get to the level of Jane Eyre, but it just depends on where they are. So they can listen to a higher level of difficulty and understand it when they're listening than when they are reading. Something new that I learned is actually I think that audiobooks are good for kids that are multilingual. So maybe if one parent is Russian or Ukrainian or Greek and they are speaking their native language to the child at home, if they're not hearing enough English at home, their English might be, for a time, a little slower to develop. Obviously, kids that are learning multiple languages in the long run are way ahead of other children who just learn one language as a child. But I do think that audiobooks can give a child who is learning multiple languages more help in hearing the English pronounced correctly. So if they have a mom that maybe has a heavy accent, and even if she's speaking English to the child, it's going to, obviously she's going to convey that accent. And so an audiobook, I think, can help with that and can help let the child hear what words are supposed to sound like. And often you'll hear if a child reads something, they won't know how it's pronounced. And so they might struggle with it. But if you just said the word to them, they're like, oh yeah, I know that word, right? And so eventually those listening and reading skills will come together. But I just think it's helpful for kids to hear proper English spoken with audiobooks. Now, it's also good, I believe, for kids who read really quickly, who are maybe skipping words or sections, or who don't read carefully. Now, these are actually the kids that tend to love reading. It's often very smart, very academic, very verbal girls. That's where I've noticed it the most. And you hand them a book and they're done with it in a day or two, right? They went really fast. If you kind of maybe ask them what was in it, they might not know. And I think what's happening is that they're reading it so quickly that, as I said, they're skipping sections and they're not taking the time. They get the gist of it, so they're not taking the time to read the details. And so what an audiobook will do for them is slow that down, where they actually have to listen to the actual story. So if you think you might have one of these really fast, non-careful readers, try an audiobook and see if they can answer questions about the book and have a better understanding than when they were just reading it. Now, I think audiobooks are obviously great if you're going on car trips. They're great for listening as a family, late at night, if mom's too tired to read, if you've already been reading to your kids throughout the day. Everyone cuddles up on the couch, kind of dims the lights, and you listen to a chapter of something together. It's just a really fun and warm activity for everyone to do together. But kids can also listen while they're doing their chores or while they're doing some hobbies. If you have a child that's maybe doing some leather working, they can listen to Treasure Island or, some story that will engage their mind as they are working with their hands. So where do you get audiobooks? Well, the public library actually has a pretty large selection, usually of CDs. Of course, there's Audible that you can get for a subscription. There's a free website that was way before Audible, and it's called Librivox, Librivox. And they are trying to read, it's all volunteers, but they are trying to read every book in the public domain and offer it for free. So it's a completely free website, but of course the books have to be in the public domain to be listed there. We also really enjoyed Jim Weiss stories, and so you can buy a CD of that. He tells all types of historic stories and myths and legends, stories from American history, from really all over the world. He does some science stories like Galileo and the Stargazers. Just a really rich library. I think he has hundreds of recorded things now available on his website. I think it's jimweiss.com. And finally, you can actually make your own recording. Now, this is a really great activity for a grandparent, a godparent, or an older child to do, is you can buy a very small recorder, $20 from Walmart, and you just turn it on and read the story. My father did this actually for my kids. When they were very young, I asked him to buy them No Roses for Harry and Harry by the Sea, 2 Harry the Dirty Dog books that we really loved. And so he bought them. He lived across the country. He recorded them. He recorded himself reading it, and then he sent it to my kids. So then my kids kind of had one of the big picture books, where they could listen to Grandpa reading the story. And so, now that my parents are departed, it's become a treasure for us. And it really doesn't take that long. You can even do this for your husband as he's commuting. I've been doing this for my husband for years now, and I think I have most of the St. Dimitri, the Rostov, great collection of the lives of the saints recorded, butchering all of the Greek and Russian names completely, but we just pushed through it, and several other books that if I'm reading it anyway to my children, I just turn the recorder on, and now my husband gets to listen in on his way to work. So it's very simple. It's a great thing to do for other people. So audiobooks, not the same as reading to yourself, but a lot of really positive things you can get out of that. Lastly, I would say about audiobooks, if you do have a child that is learning to read later, I think audiobooks is a way to keep them listening to stories that are on their mental level, but where their reading hasn't actually caught up yet. And I had one child that struggled with dyslexia and reading so much that we actually would get some of his textbooks as audiobooks. I know Apologia offers this, and it just helped him sometimes. Sometimes the reading for the week was so much that he couldn't complete all of it, but he could listen to his high school level science textbooks auditorily, and it really helped to keep him on track. So audiobooks are great. Now, another question I've gotten before is, can a child read too much? And I think, yes, they can. And I would watch out for kids that get too into something, especially fantasy. Again, this tends to be with girls. Tween girls are incredibly impressionable. And the fantasy books it's kind of a potato chip book anyway. It's not, none of these books are very well written. But there's something about it that really resonates, and girls in particular can become obsessed with this. Now, again, reading is a necessary skill, but I do think that reading too much takes away time from learning other skills and developing other parts of themselves. So if you have a child that, likes to read 8 hours a day, well, that's actually not healthy for them, right? They need to be outside and playing. They need to be learning how to do the home chores, right? Whether it's cooking, cleaning, mowing the lawn, whatever it is, those are actually important. And if you allow your child to overread, which yes, is possible again, they're going to be what I call lopsided, right? They're going to have a lot of skills in reading and reading fast, although I don't think they're always reading carefully. But maybe they won't have the hand-eye coordination or the dexterity to do finer work that they should be developing. And so we want to, everything has its place, and we want to be moderate in everything that we do. And so I would watch out for letting a child read for too much for that reason. I think actually the same goes for video games, or anything that maybe becomes addictive for a child. Like there's a lot of arguments against video games for what they do to your brain. However, there's an argument that is often not made, which is everything your child should be doing in the time slot that they are actually on playing the video game or online on YouTube or whatever the kids are doing, right? If they're doing something so much online or, on devices, one of the things that we often miss is all the things they're not doing. They're not cooking. They're not learning how to clean. They're not having eye contact. They're not having conversations, right? And so we have to stop thinking about it as just, video games are bad, which forgive me, I think they're probably not that great. I think they are probably bad. But all the good things that they're actually missing out on top of that. And so excessive reading can actually fall into this. And I think if you look at the life of monks and nuns, you'll see that there's a time for everything. There's a time to get up and pray. There's a time for spiritual reading. There's a time for, taking care of your own, personal needs. You're cleaning your bedroom or whatever. And then there's time for serving the community, and there's time for being with the guests. Everything has its place. And if anything gets out of context, if you do anything too much, then you're not going to have time for the other things, right? And we don't want, to have lopsided people, so to speak. We want our kids to be kind of well-rounded as we can help them to be. Okay, so what about reading aloud? I think reading aloud is just one of the best activities you can do with your kids. And I really love reading aloud. It was a standard in our homeschool for many years. It still is, even though I only have one child left at home. We read to each other now. But even as teenagers, I think they still enjoy it. They still crave it. It gives you that moment in the day to connect, to kind of unwind, right? You can read aloud in the morning and or in the evening. Sometimes mom might read in the morning and dad read a bedtime story. You can certainly incorporate the scriptures and spiritual books. And the thing about reading out loud is that if you're reading the right books, then it's going to be a delight for everyone. One example might be Winnie the Pooh. The original Winnie the Pooh stories are often thought of as, children's books, right? But if you haven't read these as an adult, they are so much fun. Anyone of any age can enjoy Winnie the Pooh, and that is really the hallmark of a classic story. Is that even if it's a children's story, it still resonates with you as an adult because they're so well written. Again, going back to those potato chip books that are not a joy for anyone to read. They try to make them for kids, but it's a cheap imitation, right? It's not the real thing. So if you're picking the right books in your read aloud, no matter the age of your kids, they're going to enjoy it. And so how do you find those books? Well, there's a really wonderful book that we started with called the Read Aloud Handbook. And I wasn't actually a big reader when I was a child. I didn't start reading until I started reading out loud to my own children when they were toddlers. And so this Read Aloud Handbook for me was invaluable because it taught you the importance of read aloud and what it does for children's minds. And then in the back of the book, it actually gives you different summaries for books for kids of different ages, hundreds of summaries. And so we really discovered all of the classic books through that book, the Read Aloud Handbook. I'm sure it's probably still in print. My edition was from 20 years ago, so I hope that it's still a good book. I think that even if there's something maybe doesn't set right with you, there's still enough value in the book that it was incredibly helpful. And so from that, we learned, about books like Corduroy or Ping or Harry the Dirty Dog. And it would give you a little synopsis of the story and who it was good for, what age group. And so that's the Read Aloud Handbook. But there's also another great resource called the Read Aloud Revival. And this is a website run by a homeschool mom. I believe she's Catholic, and she encourages you to read aloud, and she has a ton of resources on her website. So it should be readaloudrevival.com. Highly, highly recommended, especially if you're unsure of what books might work for your kids. Okay, so getting back to kind of the big picture here. So I think it's a hard truth that we have to get used to, that we have to be vigilant. A long time ago, we could kind of cut our kids loose in public. By a long time ago, I mean, the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, we were free to roam. We were, free to peruse the library, and parents knew that it was pretty safe. But unfortunately, that's not really the case anymore. The library has undergone massive changes in the last 20 years when I started going with my younger kids. 20 years ago, at least in California, a lot of the classic children's books were still there. Many of those books were retired and never repurchased, or they're just out of print. On top of that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of money being pumped into the public library system to buy alternative lifestyle books and other things that are very objectionable to our Orthodox faith. And so those books have really come front and center. And the library system. So the library is not a safe place where you can just let your kids roam anymore. And it really breaks my heart to say that, but I think it's the truth. Neither is your local bookstore. The bookstore tends to be more on the commercialized end, and the public library more of the propaganda end, but they both have the component of the other. Again, I want to say that we're not talking about a few isolated titles. We're talking about a tidal wave of books. Okay, these are books that are read by kids in public school. They are signed by the teachers. They're recommended online. They're made into movies. You can buy the action figure, the t-shirt, or the backpack that goes along with it. These are the staples of the children's book world at this point. You actually have to go out of your way to find books that are good and healthy for your children. And so what's the outcome of this? It's if children see these types of books, the new books that are against our faith, whether it's the twisted stories, whether it's the alternative lifestyle, the very dark books, the children begin to think that these ideas are normal and acceptable. And I believe that their worldview is being shaped by them. And so we have to start to think a little more long-term here. If the library and the bookstore are no longer a safe place for our kids to go and find books, then it's time that we build our own libraries. And I would start with a robust home library, but I think you could also get together with other people in your parish and build a children's library in your parish or in your local homeschool group. I think if you had a parish library, you could also focus on buying all of these wonderful Orthodox children's books that have really started to come out in the last few years. 20 years ago, there were very, very few Orthodox children's books. And now that they've gotten more numerous and more beautiful, longer, they're just wonderful now. The Friends of Christ series by New Rome Press is a must-have for every single home library. The books are expensive, so I understand if you're a young family and you can't afford that. Often we couldn't when we were just starting out. And that's why I think the parish could actually step in. And if the parish could spend even $20 a month on one wonderful children's book, right, for their parish library, think of the impact that would have on the kids in your parish after years and years of collecting these wonderful books for them. A lot of parishes have parish libraries, but they're often, and understandably, they're often for the adults, right? But it's time that we start thinking about what are the children reading and provide them with good quality books to read. And so I mentioned before the two resources, the Read Aloud Handbook and the Read Aloud Revival, but you should also find people of like-mindedness with you and share book recommendations back and forth. Some of these good books that I'm talking about are already out of print, are already difficult to find. So once you have them, if you find them at library sales or thrift stores, online used book sales, or garage sales, if you find these books, hold on to them, right? You always have room for more books. This is my belief in your home library. You always have room for a few more. Hold on to these because they are not being reprinted anymore. And they're getting harder and harder to find. So in closing, I want to say that when I first started thinking about this topic a few years ago, I felt like I really had to make the case that there were evil people out there targeting our children through, among other things, children's books. And I think a lot of people maybe thought I was overreacting. But I also think that the events of the last few years have more than proved my point. And I think a lot of parents have woken up and seen with their own eyes that the books made for kids are clearly sending anti-Christian messages to the children. This is no longer being hid. It's out in the open now. And so I just want to recap with some of the things we started with to remember that not every book is worth reading. That language skills are not our only goal, right? Our main goal is to develop healthy attitudes, healthy morals, and healthy souls in our children. Increasingly, our children are being exposed to books and other media that do directly assault their Christian faith. Remember that it is better to be illiterate than to read certain books. I'm going to say that again. It is better to be illiterate and to never read a single book than to read certain books. Remember that books change you. You're going to be different after you read a book. Your child will be different after the book that they read. Many children are being harmed by the books they read, even Christian homeschool kids, even Orthodox kids, because we are not being attentive to what they are reading and what they are thinking. We have to go back again and again to books are food for the mind and the soul. And if you want to have a healthy mind and soul, you have to give them a healthy book. So know what your child is reading. Don't be pressured into giving them something harmful. If you don't know if a book is harmful or not, just wait. Don't give it to them. Investigate further. Look it up on Amazon. Ask other people, right? Just wait. There's no rush. Build your home library. Share book recommendations with other like-minded people. And most of all, fill your children with truthful, beautiful books. If there's any question I haven't answered for you about books, please drop it in the comments below. Until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless you.